Everyone, I'm Bridget. I'm going to talk today about comparing neural representations in AI systems and the human brain. So to start off, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview. I want to start with some background on what multimodal models are and also some of the human brain architecture and kind of how that relates to multimodal models. Then I want to dive in a little bit about the relationship between these two things, so kind of looking at relations between artificial and biological intelligence. And then I'm going to talk about looking into specific cognitive processes between multimodal models and humans, specifically going to talk about emotion detection and spatial reasoning. And then I'm going to go into a little bit about how we can use these tasks and use different cognitive processes to better interpret what is happening in multimodal models and what may not be there yet and how that can relate to human cognition. Cool. So just a little background. I'm coming from a vision science lab. So our whole interest in multimodal models kind of stems from an interest in human visual processing and how that can relate to higher cognition. So I'm just going to start off with a little bit about the architecture of multimodal models and how that relates to the architecture of the human brain. So right here, I have two examples of what we define as a multimodal model. We're just kind of loosely defining them as any large language model with vision capabilities. So one really popular version of that is the GPT-4 and all the different versions of that. And there's also smaller models that are open source like LLaVA. And all these models are pretty similar to each other in architecture. They have some sort of vision encoder. So that takes an image or some type of vision stimulus and is allowed to extract features from it. One of the most popular ones is CLIP, and CLIP is actually trained on image caption pairs. So when it extracts features out of images, it actually gets linguistic and visual components of that image. Then second, in the little projection orange layer of the LLaVA architecture, you see that most models have some sort of projection layer. That's usually just some simple linear component that will map visual space into language space before it is finally put into the third and final layer, the language model. And that can be anything from GPT-4's own language model. LLaVA uses Vicuna, sometimes it uses Mistral. You can kind of play around with which language model you want to use. And I'm specifically pointing out these two models because they're the ones we're going to be talking about the most during this talk. So then kind of relating that to the vision system of the human brain, we kind of see that there are two main visual streams occurring in the human brain. One of them is the ventral visual stream. This is stuff you would associate with typical visual perception, like object recognition. And then you have the more complex dorsal stream, which is more related to spatial awareness, attention, mental transformation, things you wouldn't naturally associate with vision, but have a lot of visual components within it. And to give you a little more context about how those streams might work in the same task, we're going to talk a little bit about mental rotation. This is when you're given a shape and you're going to be able to decide whether other shapes are the same or different than this reference shape. So if you're given this example, these two shapes are clearly very different. So all you really need is your ventral stream to extract the shapes out of those images. So you can just say they're completely different shapes. Something more complex like this, you might have to engage your dorsal stream a little bit more to actually rotate that figure to actually come to a conclusion that those are the two same shapes. So you can see that these streams interact with each other and sometimes one will be more online than the other. And we're going to reference these streams a little bit more throughout this talk. So after looking at how those architectures are formatted, we kind of wanted to see how they're related to each other in kind of behavior and what representations are actually held within the architectures themselves. And really cool, once you actually look into their representations, you find that they're really well aligned when it comes to language and vision. Multimodal models are really good at modeling the ventral visual stream. They're great at modeling language in the brain, and they're also really good at capturing the shared space between language and vision. So what I mean by that is if you purely train a model on just visual features of a multimodal model, it can actually transfer to predict language activity in the brain and vice versa. All these papers I'm citing right here use a very similar approach. Most of these use voxel-wise encoding models to do their method, and I'm going to dive in a little bit to these because we'll talk about them a little bit more in the future. So voxel-wise encoding models, in general, they're just a way to map extracted features from a multimodal model to predict brain responses. So in this way, you're kind of replacing the human sensory processing system with whatever AI is extracting from images or text to see if that has any relationship to what human behavior or human cognition is like. So just a general overview of how that works. You start with a batch of text or visual stimuli, like I have that set of images in the bottom right corner over there. And then you need corresponding brain data for those images. So a good example of this is the NSD data set, which is the natural scenes data set. It takes a bunch of COCO images, which are just naturalistic images, and it collected basically a bunch of brain data based on those images. So you have image and image paired with the evoked brain activity from those images. So once you have that, you can feed those same images through a multimodal model, extract features somewhere in the intermediate layers of those models, and then use those features to build a linear, multi-target linear model to predict brain activity. And what I mean by multi-target is you're going to use all the features to individually predict each voxel in the brain's activity. A voxel is just a 3D pixel in the brain, so that encompasses the entire volume of the brain at the end when you get that output encoding matrix. Great. So based on these findings, we really wanted to dive more into the specifics. We are curious about which brain structures specifically AI systems are capturing and what natural cognitive processes they're exhibiting and what they might fail at. So to do this, we kind of developed our own approach where we start off by just playing with models. We're usually playing with ChatGPT a lot, seeing what it can do, what it can't do to identify certain cognitive processes of interest. Then we go on and we use experiments from cognitive science and cognitive psychology to actually administer to these models as we would in humans and animals. And then we also go beyond that to use voxel-wise encoding models to actually look in the internal representations to see how that might explain why we're getting the behavior we see in those tasks. Great, and just a general central hypothesis we've developed before I go into any of the tasks we've conducted. We have this general idea that multimodal models, since they learn language and images together, they've kind of glued together the capabilities of the ventral visual stream and the language network together. So because of that, when they're doing tasks that have computations that are aligned with the visual ventral stream, they'll do great, but anything that tops outside of that network, we expect to find really poor performance with. Okay, so for our first example, right when GPT-4 preview, which was the first vision model that OpenAI released, came out, we started playing with it a bunch. And right off the bat, we noticed that it has this really impressive propensity to ascribe mental states. So you can give it a pretty straightforward image, like people reaching out to touch a whale, and it kind of goes beyond typical visual processing. It doesn't just identify objects, it actually starts talking about what people's intentions are and even what their emotional states are. So you can see in that bottom sentence, it says they seem curious and excited about the encounter. And if you prompt it even more and ask it why it thinks that, it will mention that their hands are reaching out, which is a signal of like curiosity and interest. So it seems to have a really good way of describing emotion and intention. And even if you give it a more simple input image like this, it will also go beyond just describing basic visual aspects of this image. It will talk about how the stick figure looks like it's attempting to throw the ball over. So it's kind of talking about goals, which is a little beyond what we'd expect from just a basic vision model. So to look into this more, we wanted to administer it some sort of emotion detection task. We chose the RMET, which is the reading the mind and the eyes task, because it's really popular in cognitive psychology. It kind of has aspects to theory of mind and is really robust when finding like emotion detection scores for people. So how this task works is you're given an image of someone's eyes and 4 corresponding words, and you're just supposed to select the word that best describes what you think the person is thinking or feeling. So for that one, it's playful. Next one, regretful. And it's a pretty difficult task. There's 36 items. Average people get about 26 of them. And this is the typical distribution you see with healthy controls. So it's pretty normally distributed, and the average is somewhere between like 25 and 28. So we took this task, we adapted it for the GPT-4 API, and we administered it. And these were our original results. So we did it with both GPT and LLaVA, just because GPT is always state of the art. It always does really great, but it's also a huge model that's trained on a lot of data and most likely has a really large architecture behind it, where LLaVA is a really smaller open source model. It's not trained on as much data, and it's also just smaller in architecture as well. So we kind of wanted to see how those would compare to each other. Here we see that GPT does really great. It's kind of reaching that exact average human performance, and LLaVA is doing pretty poor. It's barely reaching the lower bounds of human performance. So that kind of made us question whether GPT-4 is doing better because of its data or because of its architecture. Could be that more data means it's just better at the task, it's had more examples to be trained on, or it could be that something in its architecture is better formatted to extract like emotional features from the images we're giving it. So to look into that question, we wanted to try to fine-tune LLaVA to be better at the task and match GPT's performance. The idea behind this is that when you fine-tune a model, you're basically adding data to that model. You take a pre-existing model and you only unfreeze a couple weights, so you're still very modestly keeping the bulk of the model the same, so it keeps its same capabilities, but you're training it to be slightly better at a specific task. So the idea was, if we could add data to this model and make it better, that kind of supports the whole data as the driving force of this emotion detection task. So this is a brief overview of how we fine-tune the model. We took all the words that are contained in the RMET, generated some AI images for them, and then also generated captions for those images from ChatGPT. So after fine-tuning LLaVA, our best version of our fine-tuned model is that bright pink one right there, and you can see it reaches the lower bounds of GPT's performance. So since we were able to enhance it a pretty good amount, we are pretty confident that data is a driving force of emotion detection and RMET performance. And we got even more evidence for that because as OpenAI released more and more GPT vision models, they just kept getting better and better at the task. And it's probably unlikely that OpenAI is changing anything about the architecture of the models. It's probably more that they're just adding training data and changing how that is formatted. So now to go back to the understand portion of this, we wanted to look specifically at the representations within LLaVA and see how that might contribute to why it's so good at the RMET. So we wanted to see if LLaVA's representations are changed at all by fine-tuning. If you're fine-tuned on a task, it might change how the representations are formatted, making something better at emotion detection. So we wanted to look into that. I decided to go with a different fine-tuning approach this time, just because I wasn't very happy with how RMET specific the last task was. I wanted something more similar to how humans do emotion detection, and I also wanted something without AI-generated content because it felt kind of weird training LLaVA on content that was generated by Adobe and ChatGPT. I wanted something a little more cleaner and a little more validated, so I decided to try to find some pre-existing data sets. And what I decided on was to use valence arousal dominance data sets. This is a classic way to dimensionalize emotions. So valence is usually like the positivity or negativity of emotion. Arousal is the intensity of that emotion. And then dominance is a little more complex, but it's basically how much control someone has over a situation. So you can see here, this is an example of the data I found. I found one data set that just contained a bunch of images and their VAD scores. And I found a data set that just had a bunch of words and their VAD scores. So since you can kind of map these in 3D space, you can pair them up really well just by reducing the distance between them. And so I was able to pair images and words together and then also throw some distractor words in. So it'd kind of be like the RMET where when I'm fine-tuning the model, I'm making it choose a best word out of 4 words to match the image. And also in my fine-tuning prompt, I tried to add in a little bit of chain of thought reasoning, just because that really helps multimodal models learn a task better just with next token prediction and the base language model. It helps if there's steps included. So I tried to make it take the VAD out of the image first, then give VAD ratings for each word, and then based on all of those composite VAD ratings to select the best word for the image given. And this was actually pretty successful. It boosted performance from an RMET score of 14 to an RMET score of 20, just with 5 training epochs. And so then to actually look into what in the representations could have changed, we did some voxel-wise encoding models. This time I used the NSD dataset, which is the one I mentioned. It just has a bunch of naturalistic images, so that naturally contains a lot of face images, which I thought would be a good thing to examine to see if representations of faces had changed at all in features. So again, the method was to use the COCO images in the NSD dataset, tag images of human faces, and then compare a voxel-wise encoding model based on base LLaVA features and compare that to the fine-tuned model's features. And I used R² for these measures and decided to visualize areas of interest in the brain. So right here is a flat map of the brain, which is a little weirder looking than your typical brain visualization. It's basically all the cortical areas of the brain flattened out. So it's nice when you're just looking at a specific subset of areas. Here we see a lot of the visual cortex displayed. The actual labels are a little bit blurry, but one of the areas of interest was the FFA, which is where the arrow is pointing to, and that's a face processing area. So we could be curious whether something is changing there. So comparing those features, they end up to actually build basically the same exact encoding model. And it's not too surprising when you look at the data a little more. If you're looking at the actual results of the model, even with the base model, you're producing a really great voxel-wise encoding model. It's great at capturing a lot of the general area in the visual cortex and super good at capturing the facial processing area specifically. So this kind of tells us that even with base LLaVA, we're already extracting the correct information from those images. And it's more probably about how the output is formatted at the end that actually makes the model better at the task with fine tuning. So when we think about this a little more in terms of human cognition and what multimodal models are, we can kind of think of RMET as a perfect task for vision for perception or that ventral visual stream. Like humans, these models are just learning to translate visual input like pixels into emotion words or labels. It's kind of like a caption image pair if you want to think about it that way. And so when you're giving it enough examples, it really learns that association super well and is able to do this task. And even though emotion detection seems really complex to us at the surface level, if you really think about it in this way, you can see that it's really just trying to match a label to a certain image. So if you give a model a bunch of image caption pairs, it'll probably learn that translation. Great. And are there any questions here before I move on to the next part? Yeah.
The question is my eyes are good on the slides.
Yeah.
Curious what the range is here.
Yeah, good question. So it goes from 0 to a little above 0.8. Yeah. So yeah, the areas in bright yellow, which are mostly like the FFA and the EBA, are the best predicted areas. And those are just like face and body areas. So that makes sense with the model we're testing. Yeah. You mean when I'm talking about like architecture versus data? Oh. I think more like fundamental model changes, like don't expect any huge layer differences, any of that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 We had the same thought. So we actually use the whole AI generated content to make a new RMET. So basically same tasks, same words, but just new images that are probably available online. They're just reserved to us right now. And we also administered those to people to see how well people did on the original RMET versus our new RMET. And we saw the same difference in GPT performance on both of those as we saw in humans. So it was kind of a fact check that GPT-4o wasn't probably trained on that model. It's not completely robust, but it was a little bit of a signal that it probably hasn't seen that data.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The features, so are the features, that extracted from different layers?
Yeah. So this one is like the layer right after the multimodal projector. So if I go back to it's right after that projection layer of LLaVA right there. So the one in the orange. So right before it gets put into the language model. Yeah. But I played around with other layers too, and it doesn't make, as long as you're doing it after the vision encoder and like within the language model, the features contain pretty like similarly predictive features for the brain data. Yeah. I think other studies have looked into that a little bit, and there is some more relationship there. Yeah. Cool. Okay, great. I'm going to move on to our next task, which is about spatial reasoning. This stemmed from some new observations with the same image I showed before. There's also some references to spatial relationships between things. So it recognizes that black line as a black barrier, and you would need to throw the red ball over that black barrier to get it to the other side. So there's some pretty surface level references to spatial relationships that we wanted to investigate more. And a typical way for vision scientists to investigate visual representations is just by flipping an image or a stimulus upside down and seeing how that changes responses. So we did that for GPT-4, and it completely lost all the concepts it had in the beginning of what was happening with the stick figure. It mentioned that this is like a pendulum image, which is just completely off what it originally said. And this was pretty surprising to us because even if you prompt GPT-4 with imagine this image flipped upside down, it still gives you this response of it's a pendulum and there's something swinging. So we were pretty surprised by that because that seems like a pretty simple spatial transformation to do. And we wanted to investigate that a little more. So we decided to make a couple tasks that all evaluate spatial reasoning. One of them is this perspective taking task with a fire hydrant. It was pretty simple. We just generated images of someone who's either walking next to a fire hydrant on their left or walking next to one on their right. And we asked the model to answer when the model's perspective, so when the image perspective is not aligned with the person's perspective, it just gets it completely wrong. You can see that it gets 12% on 50 trials. But if the perspectives are aligned, then it does really good at the task. And this might not be surprising to a lot of you because if you work with GPT a lot, you'll notice that once you prod enough and play enough, you'll find some really surprising lack of spatial reasoning. This was an example where we were trying to see if it could tell whether people's eyes were looking to their left or right. And I got the reinforcement learning response where it asked me which answer do I prefer. So it was kind of just a complete fail in even giving me a guess of what was right. So to do this, we decided to go back to perspective taking and make a more robust task. The reason we chose perspective taking is because it's actually a really well-studied phenomenon in developmental psychology. So it's cool because we have this huge human developmental timeline that corresponds to perspective taking. And the literature has also divided perspective taking into two levels, which we'll kind of go into right now. So level 1 perspective taking is a more simpler version. It's just knowing that a person may be able to see something you don't. And this develops in humans around 1 to 2 years of age, so pretty early on. A good way to test this is to just ask whether a shape is in front of or behind someone. And GPT-4 does a really good job of doing this task. And level 2 is a little more complex. It's more about the ability to represent how a scene could look different from someone else's perspective. And this has a really late developmental trajectory. It's around 6 to 10 years old. And you can examine it by asking some like left and right questions. So in this task, we developed images of whether a cube was to someone's left or right, kind of like that fire hydrant perspective taking task. And then you can also go beyond spatial relationship judgments and go more into like visual judgments of how someone's visual scene can change based on their perspective. So we also incorporated these visual judgments into our task too, that involved M's and W's, 6s and 9s, and then a smile and a frown. So like I said, multimodal models, GPT and LLaVA can do really good at level 1 perspective taking, but we don't really know how well they are doing at level 2 perspective taking. So we kind of wanted to investigate that more and see exactly if they fail, and if they do, where do they fail in the task. So one thing that's interesting about perspective taking in the actual literature is that you have aligned and unaligned trials. So this is when viewer perspective matches the avatar's perspective, like in that aligned 0-degree trial. And then you also have the reverse, where you have an unaligned perspective, where your perspective is different than the person's perspective. And that would be around like 180 degrees. And on unaligned trials, a lot of times you're prompted to do a sort of mental rotation to match that person's perspective. So you might feel yourself that you're either rotating yourself into that avatar's shoes, or you're rotating the scene to match your perspective. But there's something that kind of involves that dorsal stream we were talking about before, where you're manipulating that spatial information you were given. So we tried to make a nice task of this. We took those aligned and unaligned 0-degree and 180-degree views, and we also just created a bunch of 45-degree intermediate rotations for that. So we had 8 different images to prompt our models with, and we also swapped out if the cube or the sphere was to the left or right. So we had a total of 16 images to feed into our model. And we also decided to administer this to humans, and we replicated a pretty well-known effect where when you are given an unaligned trial, you see an increase in response times for humans. So that's what that peak in the figure is. It starts around 90 degrees and peaks at 180 degrees. And that can kind of be thought of as like the time it takes to do mental rotation in your head. So going into the actual results, these results are all from GPT-4o. So these are for, is a cube left or right from the person's perspective? So level 2 spatial judgment. And right here we still have the human data back there, and then the spatial data is overlaid on it. You can see that ChatGPT or GPT-4o fails completely once there's unaligned angles involved around 135 degrees, which I've shown here. It's pretty much just responding with image-based information at this time. So even though the cube in the blue figure is to the person's left, it's just going to say that it's to the person's right, because that's what it's extracting from the image information. And we still have that mental rotation peak there, and where it peaks is exactly where, or when mental rotation kind of comes online for humans, is exactly where we see GPT-4o begin to fail at that task. And then same pattern occurs with the visual stimuli. Whenever mental rotation comes online, you see a failure in the models to do the task. And a lot of times there's this bias to one response between around like 90 and 135 degrees. It's biased to respond to 6 W's and left. And that can probably be interpreted as kind of like this unknown area where it's just defaulting to one response over the other because it's not confident in those unaligned angles. And then to try to give GPT-4o its best chance at this task, we decided to try to make it a little more linguistic reasoning friendly. So we added some chain of thought prompting to the task. So instead of just saying, is the cube to the person's left or right, we listed out some steps for it to take. So identify where the person is facing and the camera angle, then identify where the cube is to you. And then if the perspective is different, flip your answer. And so that actually completely boosted performance at 180 degrees. It became totally perfect, but it still failed to capture anything between a 90 to 135 degree rotation, which we thought was really interesting because even though language can kind of inform it to do a little better, it's still lacking the specificity that's needed or that we see in human cognition. So overall, we see that multimodal models fail to do perspective taking when mental rotation is used by humans. There's even some more evidence of that image-based processing I was talking about. So it's defaulting to the image-based information over any perspective information. And we saw that when we used some open prompts for the visual stimuli. So just saying like, tell me what letter or what numbers on the cube instead of saying, give me a 6 or a 9 or an M or a W. And when it hit these 90-degree angles, it would respond with like zeros and E's, which is exactly what those symbols look like from a 90-degree perspective, which was really interesting. So then kind of going back to the brain, we actually administered these tasks, and we started to administer these tasks in the scanner to human participants to see what areas are active when doing perspective taking. So we've kind of identified this perspective taking network in the brain. The premotor region can be involved with that like motor simulation we see that's circled in the green. The dorsal anterior cingulate is probably involved in the extra cognitive mechanisms that are required to do mental rotation. And then the posterior parietal cortex is probably involved in doing that actual spatial transformation itself and doing that mental manipulation. And it was cool here because if you look exactly in these regions in the perspective taking network, they show the same pattern of activity as we see in response times in behavior. So as the angles become more unaligned during the task, reaction times peak, and also fMRI brain responses in these regions peak as well. So they're kind of coming online to help do this task more. Great, and one main point about this is that all of these regions are lying out of the visual ventral stream. So that can be really critical to why we're seeing a failure when the unalignment kind of comes up during the task. So to look a little bit more into the actual representations in the model, once again, we're going to use some voxel-wise encoding models again. So training it on all that perspective taking fMRI data, we had about 384 samples total, so it's pretty small. It's not probably the best way to make a voxel-wise encoding model with that data. We'd more likely want to train something more naturalistic and test it on perspective taking, but we're limited by the amount of fMRI data we have for specific subjects. So in this way, we could train with all the perspective taking data and then compare correlations split between aligned trials and unaligned trials and look specifically about how that compares to the perspective taking network. So when we look at those results, we see that specifically in the dorsal anterior cingulate and the premotor cortex, we have higher correlations for aligned trials than unaligned trials. So our model, based on LLaVA's features, is better at predicting brain activity for aligned trials compared to unaligned trials. So it's kind of missing of some of the information that's needed to predict what's going on in the brain during those unaligned trials. The early visual cortex just is extracting really simple visual information, so it's not a surprise that we don't see a huge difference in information there. And so a lot of people's response when seeing these results is just saying that the models probably aren't trained on the proper data needed to do spatial reasoning. And while that might be true, when we go back to the developmental timeline of humans and perspective taking, we know that it doesn't develop until about 6 to 10 years of age, which is really late in human development. And that's after humans have been exposed to lots of our own data. They've had plenty of interaction with the world at that point. So it's kind of surprising this doesn't come online until that age. And because of this late development, we kind of have this idea that maybe the challenge of level 2 is more computational than data-driven. And we can tell that based on our perspective taking network and how it lies completely outside of the ventral stream, the computations of perspective taking probably also lie outside of vision and language networks, so they're not captured by the multimodal models at this point. And so back to our central hypothesis, we had that general idea that multimodal models are going to be really good at tasks that are aligned with the capabilities of the visual ventral stream. And we confirmed that hypothesis just by showing that it's good at the RMET. You can even train a smaller model to be really good at the RMET just by providing it a little more data. It's a pretty easy translation to go from pixels to labels, like pictures of faces to labels of emotion. However, when you do tasks that tap just a little bit outside that ventral stream, you completely lack performance. So in our perspective taking task, whenever we got to requiring a little bit of engagement from that perspective taking network, GPT-4o could not do the task at all. And one reasoning for this might just be that compared to emotion detection, language just doesn't carry as much spatial information as we ideally want it to in these tasks. So, like I said, pixels to labels is a really clear way that language can get involved in a task, and it's pretty clear to associate those two things together. However, space is a little more complex, and it's not very clear how you can like explain space linguistically. And even going back to our chain of thought reasoning, we saw that we could, with a little extra linguistic reasoning, boost GPT's performance at the 180 degrees, but it failed to capture the intermediate rotations that also involved unalignment. And so some of our future directions is to investigate this perspective-taking network a little bit more. We really want to use fMRI as a tool to investigate the development of spatial reasoning in multimodal models. And if we can specifically identify computations within those brain regions, we might be able to incorporate the computations back into the models and see where we're lacking certain areas. And this could require doing slightly like more work in the visual space of models before jumping into the language parts. We see that even CLIP is just built to extract good visually linguistic components from images so that it can be easily put into a language model, but space might require some more visual components extracted from it and some more computations that can lie within the visual aspects of multimodal models before moving on to the language parts. Great. So I want to thank all my lab mates, especially Scott, Kristen, and Brenda, who helped out with this project a lot. And I'm happy to answer any questions now.
Thank you so much. People online, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Yeah, is there any aspect of Bridget's research that you would like to have clarified?
Yeah.
The auto-regressive video model is supposed to be superior for understanding physical models. So have you played around with video?
Yeah, I'm really curious in looking into like how videos can help, but I think it's still an interesting space of whether you need a bunch of context history to learn space and you just need to feed in a bunch of different like video or images of something rotating to learn space, or if it can be done more in just the image-based realm rather than the video realm. But I do think those models are really interesting for seeing how spatial reasoning can develop in multimodal models. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm.
Tried left and right. Did you try up and down?
Yeah, I think we've done some up and down, same as kind of like in front and behind, and it can do that.
Yeah,
well.
I can do that one. Yep.
Yeah, definitely. I've thought about it a lot. There's been quite a few like large benchmarks being brought out about like spatial reasoning. I always thought it would be cool to kind of adapt that data for fine tuning, but I always come back to the feeling that it will just be good within that task and won't really be able to generalize outside, and that there is something that's like lacking the data of. Like it's not a data issue, it's more something that's like computationally driven, or right now the best ways to make models better at spatial reasoning is to add modules to them or do something that's a little external to train it on, like images that have boxes on it. So it's not as like clear exactly how to like naturally fine tune spatial reasoning in models.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bridget. If there are no other questions, we will conclude here. Next week, we're gonna pause because of Thanksgiving, and then we will resume the week after. Thank you.